Welcome back. This is week 1, lecture 2, Medieval Christendom. And this lecture is in many ways the first kind of content lecture of the course. And as I talked about in week 1, lecture 1, when I was setting up the course and everything, it's important, and I would say necessary, in order to understand the Reformation, the historical change that took place during the chronological period approximately 1300 to approximately 1600, having to know what came before. Now, in some ways, this lecture is squeezing two courses into one. Two courses that I teach. I teach History B351, the early Middle Ages, and then History B352, High and Late Medieval Europe. The late medieval Europe, I'll be getting into some of that next week, certainly. And so maybe it's like 1.5 courses anyway. And so I just want you to know that this is a brief introduction of some of the foundational concepts and structures of medieval Christendom, which I'll talk more about shortly, and define it for you, that change during the Reformation. Because one of the things we'll see, I talk about the crumbling of Christendom towards this course. In the course of the 16th century, Christendom falls apart. And I'll be talking a lot more about that as we go along. But first, we need to understand what Christendom was, which is the Middle Ages, and understand how it was possible for change like the Reformation to actually take place and what actually changed. Because I think I also said last lecture that it's easy to see things as being new that really are not new. So, and in one ways, as we'll talk about shortly too, Europe doesn't change until the French Revolution, but we'll get there when we get there. But there is change going on, and a lot of it. So, to understand Christendom, we though have to start with Rome. And I will be talking about Rome very shortly, but I first also want to address an issue of terms, because you have your foundational terms exam at the end of this week, due July 13th, Monday. Well, it's due Monday, July 13th, 11:59 p.m. I'll be talking more about this if you look at the PowerPoint slides. The last one is all about the exam. But it covers terms that I want to make sure that you have access to and know what the course definition is. Now, this lecture too, let's say a more extensive version of it, is assigned for the readings this week in The Myth of the West, chapters 4 through 10, and then the History, Myth, and Theology and Religion, or whatever it is, where you also find basic definitions. And so the definitions are there. I also want to go over a number of them with you here. And just to begin, in terms of Christendom, which is one of the foundational terms of this course, we need to realize the difference between Christendom, Catholicism, and Christianity. Now, from the rise of Christianity, Catholicism and Christianity were exactly the same. Catholic just means universal. I've had students in my Western Civ class ask me, okay, in the Middle Ages, Christendom was Catholic, but when did it become Christian? And that is a false understanding. Now, from your own theological perspective, you may say, well, Catholicism really isn't Christian. That is a theological issue, not an historical issue. So I'm not going to address that, as also I mentioned in the last lecture. But historically, when we talk about Catholicism and Christianity, they are one and the same. Now, during the Reformation, as we will see, there began to be this breakup of the medieval view, the medieval world of Catholicism, of Christianity. And then it's only then that we can start talking about Roman Catholicism as, let's say, a denomination. Before 1530, at the very earliest, Catholicism or Catholic and Christian are identical. Now, Christendom is another matter, and we'll be getting to that right now, basically. So that's the thing. And so make sure you do the reading. And this lecture is, in some ways, a comment on some of the aspects of that reading. And so, it is important in that sense to get us ready for talking about the changes that begin happening in Europe around the year 1300. So I said we have to start with Rome because we do. And if we look at the slide here, number 2, the concept of Christendom, the first item there is the myth of Rome. Now, what was Rome? The Roman Empire, and so in some ways this could also include a whole course on Rome, was an amazing thing. Rome was founded, the city was founded traditionally in 759 BCE by Romulus and Remus. Traditionally, that was the date, the origins of the city, as Romans dated their own calendar from the origins of the city. The Republic was established in 509 BC. And then we have around the turn of the dating that we now call before the Common Era, and then the Common Era, which is a newer version of BC and AD, before Christ and Anno Domini. Sometime in that late 1st century BC and early 1st century CE, there's a transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And this is an issue because of a distinction in the term empire and what it means. Now, the term empire is one we'll be seeing again and again and again in this course. And the definition changes, so you need to know what we're talking about. There is at least 2 basic definitions of empire. One is extent of hegemonic control. Now, hegemony is a term that simply means control over. If I have hegemony over something, I have control. I rule it, whatever. And so Rome was an empire long before it ever became an empire. Because the second definition of empire is a form of government. So the Roman Republic was an empire because it had established dominance or hegemonic control over all of the Italian peninsula and then expanding into North Africa from fairly early on in the Republic period. And so it's not until Rome is very extensive that Rome switches from being a republic to becoming an empire in terms of the form of government, even though previous to the emergence of the empire as a form of government, Rome was an empire in terms of hegemonic control. I hope that's kind of clear. So we need to be understanding, make sure we know what we're talking about. So what happened? I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's very complex. Roman historians can make their career talking about the fall of the Republic and the emergence of the empire. The Roman Constitution, which was not a written constitution, but it was the form of government. So we abstract from that to make an analysis of how did Rome govern itself. Under the Republic, consisted of 2 consuls, 2 chief executive officers, like presidents. It then included also the Senate, which is where the real power lay, and then a number of other offices, and then also an assembly, which was very many ways a popular body of representation. And you can already see, I think, the parallels with the U.S. version, the executive, the Senate, and then the House of Representatives being the judicial or the legislative. But with Rome, then the Senate was also the judicial. So that structure was there, and part of the provisions of that was that during times of crises, someone could proclaim themselves emperor, and I'll get back to that, emperor and dictator to establish control. Now, dictator simply means one who dictates. In our Constitution, the president, during times of war, has more extensive powers. Just think of how difficult it would be to have Congress pass laws on every military operation. It would be impossible. So being a dictator is not a negative connotation so much, at least in this context, as it is to say that the person who can speak dictates what's going to happen is a very efficient form of government. That can become corrupt, of course. And we have in Rome that happening in 88 BCE when the general Sulla marches on Rome to restore order because there was kind of chaos going on and uprisings and things. And then after he established order, he returned power to the Senate. So he gave up being a dictator. Now, here we say with the empire, and this is where it all kind of comes together. There's a third definition of empire, or emperor, etc. It simply means command. Imperium in Latin means command. So if you're a general, you have imperium over your troops if you're in Rome. If you become, like Sulla did, becomes a dictator to establish order, you become the imperator or emperor to speak what's going to happen, to dictate what's going to happen. So there are then kind of three definitions of empire, with that third one coming from imperium or command being very much related to the second definition of imperium or empire as a form of government. Because it can be confusing, because every Roman general throughout the time had imperium, the right to command. So the issue is then kind of, we have the commander-in-chief. A dictator became a commander-in-chief that has imperium, and when that individual who has imperium, who is the dictator over everything, becomes established as the form of government, not just in a time of crisis, but forever, so to speak, then we have the imperial form of government. And that took place in Rome with Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar also marched on Rome, felt that there was problems, marched on Rome, proclaimed himself dictator. He already had imperium over his own troops, but then he proclaims imperium over all of the government of the empire, or the country, or the republic. And what was different with Caesar than with Sulla was that he proclaimed himself dictator for life. Now, something else important here. The term Caesar is simply a family name. It became an office, but at first it's simply a family name. I've also often kind of joked saying if only he was named, Julius Sock, then we'd be talking about the Roman Sox as the Roman Caesars. Anyway, the point being is people in the Senate resented that. There was a lot of opposition to Caesar, and they rose up and they assassinated him within the Senate in 44 BCE. That caused chaos. To make a very long story short, what resulted was Caesar's nephew, Julius Caesar's nephew, Augustus. Before he was known as Augustus, which I'll get back to, he was known as Octavian. And Octavian was a young Roman general, and he had to fight with a couple of other people to establish his own power, which he does, finally. And in 27 BCE, before the Common Era, or BC, he gave power back to the Senate, as did Sulla. And because of that, the Senate hailed him as magnificent. In Latin, magnificent, wonderful, whatever, is august, where our term August comes from, the month of August, from the Julian calendar. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. So they referred to him as Augustus, as the magnificent one to have done that. Now, this form of government, when he returned power to the Senate, he claimed that he would only rule as a first citizen. He'd be first among equals. And this is where historians claim is the beginning of what we call the Principate. Principium as the primary one, which is the origin of the term prince and everything else, as also the beginnings, etc. So the Principium is the beginning of also of the Principiate, the beginning of the empire as a form of government. Augustus ruled by basically charismatic authority, not by office, but he kept one office for himself. Because part of the Roman Constitution, some of these other offices that I mentioned, besides the consuls, the two consuls, the Senate, and then the Assembly, was the chief priest, or the Pontifex Maximus, which was in charge of Roman religion and Roman worship, Roman cult. I'm not going to go into all the details of Roman religion. It's basically an adaptation of Greek religion. But Augustus then also ended up changing that because he did a couple of things. He had to change how people viewed him and how people viewed Rome. Because there was still, as I said, opposition. So now he had the title Augustus. He also then proclaimed himself to have been the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Now, bloodline, he was his nephew. Caesar had named him as his successor before his assassination, and Augustus claimed that Julius Caesar then had adopted him as his son. So he took on the name of Caesar. That is how he became known as Caesar Augustus, the August, the magnificent Caesar, as a family name still. But yet, too, Augustus became a title just as did Caesar. He went further, though. He also proclaimed, as Pontifex Maximus, the divination of Julius Caesar, that Julius Caesar had become a god. In the ancient world, that was not unknown. A human being was so wonderful, they were brought into the pantheon as a god, and therefore also do worship or veneration in any case, which is a distinction I'll get back to at a later point too. So therefore, Augustus Caesar, Caesar Augustus, was therefore the son of a god. And Caesar went, or Augustus went beyond, did a lot of things to change people's minds, and we can really talk about, or as scholars do, the Augustan Revolution. That Augustus effected a revolution not only of the form of government of Rome, but of the, let's say, the view of Rome and the understanding of Rome and his position in Rome. It's in some ways the first mass propaganda campaign. For example, he established himself as an image to be put on Roman coinage before Augustus. It was very rare that an emperor or a general would be on a Roman coin, sometimes for commemorative purposes, celebrating a great victory. But Augustus said systematically his image has to be on every Roman coin. He also then had proclaimed that a statue of him had to be built and set up in the town square of every city and town in the empire. And this was a very formalized statue. You probably have seen pictures of it. And he also said it had to be made, not only the form, but it had to be made by an officially sanctioned imperial workshop. So here we have it that he is putting his image again all over the empire. In his coinage, just think about what that means, as a statue, so everybody sees him. And he provided a lot of his own money and provided for the games, for bread and everything else. And he writes also a work on how fantastic he is, the wonderful deeds of Augustus, which he writes. Look at me and all the things I've done. And then he did something else. He commissioned a poet named Virgil to write a new history of Rome, or even maybe a history of Rome. Part of the Roman education foundation was Homer, the myths of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Augustus said, Virgil, I want you to write a Roman version. Now, Homer, going all the way back, we're not even exactly sure if Homer was a single person or two, or there's also been speculation that he might have been female, or one of the two Homers might have been female. But the point being is it was oral tradition that Homer writes down. What Virgil was going to do was to create a new story. And Virgil being, a hard-up poet, young poet, agreed to do so. Now, he had written, this is why Augustus commissioned him, a series of poems called the Eclogues, or pastoral poems. And in the fourth one, the fourth Eclogue, he prophesies the birth of a baby who will be the savior of the country. Augustus certainly wanted that to be him, and there has been debate, certainly among Virgil scholars, of whether he did mean that, but it's like, no, he didn't. So there's all these issues, but it fit him. His prophecy that Virgil wrote in the fourth Eclogue fit Augustus, so he could apply it to himself. And therefore he said, write the history of Rome. Now, when Christianity comes along, because again, I haven't gotten to the rise of Christianity yet in Rome, and I know this is taking a lot of time, but this is an essential background. Christians also interpreted Virgil as having prophesied Christ. Because, if you know anything about Christian scriptures, in Luke, it's, in the reign of Caesar Augustus, a decree went out that all the world should be taxed, blah, 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 blah. So it is like, it's almost at the same time. Now, Virgil wrote this massive, amazing work, the Aeneid, which establishes the myth of Rome. Now, the myth of Rome includes all of the Augustan revolutions. His image, his propaganda campaign, his name, his divinization of Julius Caesar, etc., etc. But it's really encapsulated in Virgil's work, and it's an amazing work of Latin literature. It's one of the most amazing things I've ever read in my life in Latin, or in any other language. But I'm not going to go into all those things. It's long, and Virgil portrays Rome, takes the history from the Trojan War, going all the way back to the stories of Homer, and tells it from the other side, the Roman side, whereby a minor character, minor figure in Homer, Aeneas, becomes Virgil's main character. And it was Aeneas who then fled Troy as it was burning, bringing the Trojan gods and his father, his older father, rescuing him out of the burning city. And his fate was to go to Italy, or what the Italian peninsula, and found a new city. And this was proclaimed by Jupiter. And Aeneas's mother was Venus, Jupiter's daughter, or Aphrodite in Greek, and Zeus, of course, in Greek, but Jupiter and Venus. And it's a long wandering, just like the Odyssey with Homer, of how Aeneas comes to Italy and sees the Latins and the Etruscans are fighting. He joins up with the Etruscans and the Latins, and he wins the hand of the Queen Lavinia, has the final combat with Turnus at the end to end the book, so to speak. But in the middle, in book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas goes to the underworld to find his way out. And there's another prophecy. And it's prophesying Augustus. In book 1, there's the prophecy, or actually book 2, there's a prophecy of Jupiter telling his daughter Venus not to worry, that the fate that he has decreed for her son Aeneas has not changed. He will go to Italy. He will found a new country, the Romans, and he will found Rome, basically, or at least his descendants, Romulus and Remus, will found Rome, coming from Aeneas, and his empire will be bounded only by the heavens and the oceans. It will be an eternal empire without end. And then in book 6, Aeneas goes to the underworld and then sees, labeled with his father. Augustus is brought in. Not just Julius Caesar, but Augustus. He sees these people there. And there's the other prophecy of this eternal empire, unbounded, that it is to rule the world for the good of the world. It is to bring peace. It is to support the weak, not be vengeful. Yes, to use power to defend the weak and to rule for this eternal empire. And then when the Sibyl brings Virgil back out of the underworld, there are 2 gates. The gates of horn and the gate of ivory, which he said true shades are let out. Now, the gate of ivory is the gate of false dreams. And the Sibyl leads Aeneas out from the gate of ivory back into the world. This too is a much debated passage, as I interpret it, and I'm not a Virgil scholar. But the question is, this dream of eternal empire, how much was Virgil saying that is itself a false dream? Because after book 6, beginning with book 7, Virgil says, now my tale becomes more difficult. I have to talk about wars and all the difficulties. And all this Aeneas, who had always been referred to as Pius Aeneas. And for Rome, pius simply means being religious, what a good Roman should be, which is dedication to the gods, to the state, and to your family. And Aeneas incorporated that as no other. But after book 7, he's still referred to as Pius Aeneas every once in a while, Pius Aeneas. But increasingly he's referred to as Saevus Aeneas, wrathful, vengeful, angry, raging Aeneas. And that is how it ends, with Aeneas killing his opponent Turnus. He's finally won. Turnus is begging for mercy, and Aeneas kills him. It's an amazing story. The question is, Virgil didn't feel it was finished. He wanted it to be burned. Virgil dies in 19 BCE. Augustus said, no, we have to keep this. Augustus had read to him some of the earlier books with the divine prophecy. He hadn't read the later books. So the question is, was Virgil really writing something to warn Augustus against vengeful, forceful rule rather than peace and defending the weak? Because, too, it's with Augustus that we begin to see what historians have referred to as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it's also at this time that Christianity emerged. Now, I'm going to leave most of the development of Christianity for your reading in the Myth of the West. But that is the context, at least the Roman context, of the rise of Christianity. Because what we see is the transformation of what I call the myth of Rome as this eternal empire divinely sanctioned becomes Christianized. It becomes what I call the myth of Christendom, which I'll get to a little bit shortly. I know I've spent a lot of time now here. I'm only on the first point of the first slide. So we'll see how all this goes. But the point being here is that within the course of the first, second, third, fourth century CE, or Common Era, or AD, this huge transformation where Rome becomes Christian. And the question we have to ask there is, to what extent did Rome become Christian, or did Christianity become Roman? And it goes back and forth, because Christianity was this kind of weird Jewish sect at first. They had to kind of develop, and all kinds of stories of its development. Then there's a chapter on the rise of Christianity, so I'll let you just read that, and please do, because that's important for all of this. But when we see this transition from the myth of Rome to the myth of Christendom, is really when, in my view, we can say the Middle Ages are beginning. The problem is, it takes a little while to develop fully. So, with that said, I'm going to move on to the myth of Christendom. The definition, which I give here on the slide, is a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. That's important, because Christendom was all of medieval Europe. It became that thought. And this is not my view of it. Other scholars have said this, that, when we find in medieval Latin the term Christianitas, or Christianity, we need to translate it as Christendom, not as Christian or as Christianity. Because what it's referring to is this entity, because Rome, despite popular views, never fell. Oh yeah, Rome falls in 476, when Romulus Augustulus was deposed as the last Roman emperor in the West. Because by this time there were 2 Roman emperors, like the 2 consuls. But the first time we see discussion of the so-called decline and fall of the Roman Empire is with the British Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, who, beginning in 1776 to 1792 or something like that, wrote 5 volumes, which he titled The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And that concept, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, has stuck ever since. When we look at the sources at the time, there's no mention of the fall of Rome. The Roman emperor was still in the West. In the East. The Roman emperor in the West, after 476, there's no single emperor, because Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, told the emperor in the East, saying, you know what, this guy, your partner emperor over here, Romulus Augustulus, the little Romulus and the little Augustulus, isn't really worth much. I'll tell you what I'll do. But let me depose him. I will rule the western part for you. And the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, Constantine founded, or Istanbul today, thought that was a pretty good deal. So he was now the single emperor over all of the empire, and he had his basically vicar, which I'll come back to, as ruler of the western part. The idea of Rome remains, and I think I talk about that in the readings, which I'll leave the rest of that for the readings, because we can trace it all the way to almost present day in terms of the idea of Rome, the myth of Rome, and the impact that has. Now, please know that the myth of Rome does not refer to, as I use the term, Romulus and Remus. That was a myth of the Romans in terms of their own foundation. For me, the myth of Rome is the Augustan Revolution, whereby Rome is portrayed as a divinely sanctioned, eternal empire with no boundaries and no end. And that myth of Rome became Christianized. Now, when we have that development, we have to also realize that the new Rome, as we'll be talking about shortly, was very different from the old Rome. This is not the same as the Holy Roman Empire, even though they're related. That's where some of this is going. We have the full, in my view, the full emergence of Christendom with the reign of Charlemagne, which I'll get back to, because Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor on December 25th, 800 CE, by the Pope. He was not crowned Holy Roman Emperor. He was crowned Roman Emperor. In the readings, you'll see more of the development as we go through the readings. But what was going on with Charlemagne was that, in the Pope's view, the Bishop of Rome, and that's a whole emergence, and the term Pope just means Papa. That's what it is in Italian. That's what it is in Latin. Papa, which is what? Papa, father, daddy. And the Pope, it was an issue of supremacy, and I'm not going to go into the whole issue of the East and the West, and that gets to be a major problem. There's an official split in 1054 called the Great Schism between the Eastern Greek-speaking church and the Latin Western-speaking church. That began to be increasingly a problem because the Eastern Roman Empire became predominantly Greek-speaking, and the Western Roman Empire was predominantly Latin-speaking. But the question is then, okay, how do we deal with all of this? And with Charlemagne, even though there's, stages of development, like the Franco-Papal alliance that you will read about, whereby the Pepin made an alliance with the Pope to depose the last Merovingian Frankish king and to set himself up as king, and to defend the papacy. So there gets to be this very close relationship between the Franks, which was a Germanic tribe, and the papacy. And Charlemagne was the grandson of Pepin. But when the Pope crowns Charlemagne Roman Emperor, he was already the king of the Franks, and he also already had an extensive empire. But this just gave him a bit more sanction. And he was somewhat ambivalent, at least according to his biographers, of the title, but he accepted it. He didn't reject it. Because King of the Franks was fine for him. He was very much a Frankish king. Now, Charlemagne is a French term, which we just adopt in English. In Latin, it is Carolus Magnus, the great Carolus, or the great Charles, or Carl. In Latin, it is Karl der Grosse, the great Karl. In English, it's Charles the Great. And in French, it's Charlemagne. That's where we get Charlemagne. And Charlemagne really was great. He affected an intellectual renaissance. He centralized administration. And he was very much a hands-on ruler and a great general and soldier, traveling constantly. And again, you can read more about some of the details of his empire and structure in The Myth of the West as a sign for this week. But it's here that we have this concept of the Roman Empire that had always been, was now with Charlemagne. It was a concept called the Translatio Imperii, the translation of the empire, going all the way back to 330 CE, which Constantine. Please, this is important too. Constantine was not the first Christian emperor. He was the first emperor to legalize Christianity. Theodosius, in the end of the 4th century, made Christianity the only legal religion. But Constantine also then moved the capital of Rome from Rome to Constantinople. Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The problem was, how do we deal with all this? And then with Theodosius, there was a single Roman emperor until Theodosius, and Theodosius proclaiming Christianity the only legal religion of Rome, 391 to 394. When he dies in 395, he split the empire once again between East and West between his two sons. This Translatio Imperii. In the Christian tradition, the idea was when Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople, he had translated, which is really what it means, bringing across. Translatio is a bringing across from one language to another, or empire from one place to another. We talk about the translations of the saints, which is moving the remnants of the relics of the saints. But the Translatio Imperii, the translation of the empire, was seen as having been initiated by the Pope. The Pope granted Constantine sanction for moving to Constantinople. There's other issues in there I'll talk about a little bit later. The point being is, the argument was with Constantine being crowned emperor, it was seen that the emperor at the time in the East had fallen into heresy. And therefore, it was not a legitimate emperor. So there was an imperial vacancy. So if the Pope can move the empire from the Romans to the Greeks, or from the Latins to the Greeks, he can move the empire from the Greeks to the Germans. And since Charlemagne was so important for the Pope and the papacy, he crowns, and since there was imperial vacancy because the emperor in the East had fallen into heresy, he crowns Charlemagne Roman emperor, which was the same continuing Roman empire as always had been since Augustus, at least in their minds. And Charlemagne did have hegemonic control over more territory than any single individual had since Rome, since Romulus Augustulus, even though his control was very ambiguous. But at least theoretically, he had imperium over all of the West. That is what we're talking about with Christendom. Charlemagne expanded the boundaries of Christendom when he fights against the Saxons, another Germanic tribe in the north, and defeats them. He issues a capitulary, and we have these, which is a statement, an official imperial statement, to the Saxons for how they have to become Christian. So by the year 1000, basically everyone within what we call today Europe was Christian except for the Jews. They're a separate issue. And it is that kind of geographical, political entity that we refer to as Christendom, referring to the West, the Roman Empire that has remained in that form, even though it's very different from what had been. But in their minds, it's the same. And the emperor is in charge of it. But the question is the emperor in charge of Christendom, or is the Pope? And that gets to be a huge question, and is very problematic, as we'll see very shortly. But here I want to talk about a new development. Because after about the year 1000, we see a major switch. There had been this huge endeavor to Christianize the pagan Germanic tribes. What does that mean? It means making them Christian. What does that mean? At the time, it meant being baptized and attending Christian worship or the Mass. It didn't mean how you live your life. It didn't mean anything else. And one of the great sources we have with Gregory of Tours, Bishop of Tours, in the late 6th century, it's just an amazing story. Talking about the Franks, this is before Charlemagne, this is even before Pepin. They are bloodthirsty, ruthless people, but they become Christian, and they are devout Christians. And Gregory, who is a Christian bishop, supports them because they are supporting the church. He doesn't moralize. He says not very good, some of the things they do. But it's a fantastic read. So when we talk about being Christian in the early Middle Ages up through Charlemagne, still, it simply means being baptized and attending Christian worship. But around the year 1000, it begins to be a shift, saying, okay, now that Europe is Christian, now that Christendom is Christian, How do we make it really Christian? Not just baptism, but what does it really mean to be Christian? And this is the process I call religionization. And I'm not going to go into the whole issue. I know I've already spoken here for 45 minutes or so, and I'm still on the first slide. Um, but this is a huge shift and change, beginning around the year 1000. The shift from the process of Christianization to the process of religionization. How do we make people Christian? How do we teach them what it means? And that became a pastoral endeavor, and that was one that continued for quite a long time. Now, within the concept of Christendom, not everyone was equal by any means. We have the three orders. That this is, in this structure, this three orders was to remain until the French Revolution. That's what I said earlier on, that some things didn't change until the French Revolution, because this was a legal distinction. There were three types of people, and we can say class, but class is actually a term that developed and was used to refer to socioeconomic classes by Marx and Engels. So that's not what we're talking about, but just there's ordo. The term that was used at the time is ordo, but that it's the Latin for order. But the problem is in Middle Ages, the term order could mean many different things. But legally, there's an order. And there were three orders or types of people, or classes of people. There were those who fought, or the nobles. There were those who prayed, or the priests and the clergy. And were those who were worked, or the peasantry. Now that doesn't change legally. The legal status of people, the categorization of people, does not change until the French Revolution, where the oath of the tennis court is getting rid of the three estates, because in French, ordo was estate. The three estates, same thing. Now, within that, a couple of other terms that are often used to refer to Middle Ages: manorialism and feudalism, and the rise of cities. Manorialism was the economic foundation of Christendom. It was based on a manor. There was the lord of the manor, and there was then the peasants who worked on it. I talk a fair amount about this, I think, in the Myth of the West too, and I think that probably I should just refer you to that, because this can be very complex, but it's important to understand what comes later. Because if you think about it for a second, the nobles are very much a minority. The clergy is a minority. The peasantry is everybody else. But increasingly, especially as we go into the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, there were the rise of the merchant class. And they became very wealthy. So we have very, very wealthy people who are classified as peasants. We have a whole stratification of the legal definition of peasants. Everything from serfs who were barely free to very wealthy people who were a lot wealthier than some of the lower nobility, especially in the later Middle Ages. So it's a very contentious category, or ordo. And all it meant was that you were neither nobility by blood, nor were you ordained. I'll be talking more about that as we go. I talk more about that in the Myth of the West. Now, feudalism was the cultural and political structure of Christendom. It was a ritualized oath that you had to perform, that you became the man of your lord. You were a vassal to your lord. And this became also a model that was applied to Christianity, that as Christians, we are vassals to our Lord. What does that mean? And what does it mean if we break our oath to our Lord? Those are some of the aspects that are central to this. And then with the rise of the cities, that began approximately in the year 1000, population is increasing. We can chart the development of cities. Everything begins to change around the year 1000. And this includes wealth. Includes another mode of thought, because some of these cities within the feudal structure of lord and vassal said, you know what, we don't really fit into this. So they petitioned the king or their prince to say, we want to pay our feudal dues as a whole body. And we will become your city, just like the feudal oath of I'll become your man. We'll become your city so that you can stay here. We'll put you up and everything else if you grant us a charter. And the king thought this is a pretty good idea. Why? Because what if all of a sudden there is a conflict between me as the king or the prince and one of my vassals in a city within the territory of one of my vassals? If I'm taking that out of the control of my vassal and it becomes directly under my control. This model already had been there in the early 10th century, so a little bit before about 910, the foundation of the monastery of Cluny. I'll be talking about monasteries shortly. But what the monastery of Cluny did was they petitioned the Pope and they said, we want to be out from under the control of the local bishop. We will be directly under your authority, Pope, if you grant us that privilege to be directly under your authority. The Pope said, that would be great with me. I proclaim you now an entity. I'll give you a charter, a corporation, that you are directly under me. That means, as Cluny, I don't have to listen to the local bishop, which is great, and the Pope too, because he has an ally in Cluny. And this model is going to just expand even further after the year 1000 with the development of other monastic orders, which I'll be getting to very shortly. But with the cities, it's very much, I am part of a free city, a incorporated city. Today even we have, incorporated and unincorporated cities. And what is a corporation? The most basic definition of a corporation still today is a legal person who can be sued and who can sue. This was a new thought, a new concept. The body of citizens, the corporation, the embodiment, because corpus is body in Latin. Corporation is the embodiment as a single entity. Major issue. And that was developing also if to have effects on the Eucharist, as we'll be talking about later too, in terms of the body of Christ and the mystical body and the real body and all these other things. But this is going to be important because in the empire, there's communes, chartered cities, incorporated cities. In France, were called communes, communities, comunitas. In the empire, they were called imperial cities because they were directly under the emperor. And the imperial free cities, they were free from the feudal structure, are going to be essential for understanding the development of the Reformation. So that's where that kind of comes in. Now, how did all of this work? And how did people buy into all of this in terms of this fusion of Rome and Christianity, the myth of Christendom, that all is one? I mean, the concept of that we have of the separation of church and state did not exist. They would not have understood it. Now, you will even read, not in the Myth of the West, and I don't think in Jordan's High Medieval Europe textbook either, but you'll read a lot of the places about the so-called crisis of church and state in the Middle Ages, and I may even address that. I know I do in the Myth of the West chapters that are assigned. There was never ever a crisis of church and state. The conflict was between lay power and clerical power, and here primarily the nobility and the clergy. That was when it was over. None of this would have been that big of a problem unless people believed in salvation. People believed Christianity. I have it there on the slide, the term at the bottom of this slide, the second slide or whatever it is, salvation at stake. That was what was going on. What was needed for salvation? Who was in charge of all of that? The idea was the Pope or the clergy, Pope and the clergy, was responsible for the soul, the emperor, the kings, lay rulers, temporal rulers, were responsible for the body. That becomes mixed. It becomes confusing. The gray area is not a clear distinction. So there's not a clear distinction over who would have the final say, because here's the catch. If I'm the Pope, yes, I'm not going to interfere in your affairs, O King. I'm just going to attend to my own affairs, which is sin. But what constitutes sin? If you are attacking another Christian prince, is that sinful? Could be. So I can say, you can't do that. The king will say, wait a minute, that's interfering in my affairs. The Pope says, no, it's not. It's in causa peccati. In the case of sin, that's a different issue. That's the conflict. It was a conflict that lasted throughout the high Middle Ages. We have the investiture controversy. I talk about that in the Myth of the West too, for the assigned readings. How Pope and Emperor fought, and Henry IV, as you'll read about, didn't really care about Gregory VII, and when the Pope Gregory VII excommunicated him, and in one of the most dramatic scenes of the Middle Ages, when Emperor Henry IV goes to Canossa, where the Pope is staying, dressed as a pilgrim in sackcloth, barefoot, to do penance, to get back in the Pope's graces. He's not doing that because he goes, oh my, I hurt the Pope. I offended the Pope. I need to really make amends. He's doing it because politically he has to. Because just as I said, going back to the Translatio Imperii, the translation of the emperor, if the Pope or if the emperor falls into heresy, there's a papal vacancy. So if the Pope falls into heresy, there is a papal vacancy, meaning no Pope. The problem that Henry had was not with that. It was with his other nobles, his other subjects. And they would not follow him if he was under excommunication. Because if you're under excommunication, that means no sacraments can be performed in your territory. The sacraments are the means of grace, the means by which we achieve salvation in the medieval theological view. I'll be talking more about that, a fair amount more, as we go along. So Henry had this political problem, and he realized politically to ensure his political authority and power, he needed to make up with the Pope. He did so. They come to an agreement. Henry goes back and does just exactly what he had always been doing. The Pope gets upset, excommunicates him again, but by that time Henry had established himself politically and says, to you, Pope, I don't care. If you are a prince or a king or the emperor, you are in charge. You are in charge of Christendom. You are responsible for your subjects, physically as well as spiritually. That's the conflict, because the clergy is responsible for their subjects spiritually. But as a prince, you are too. So basically, it's your clergy are the means by which you provide for your people. We'll see that again and again coming up in later lectures. And you'll see how all that plays. But that's an important thing to keep in mind. Does that mean every prince was a religiously devout person who really wanted to do their best job? No, not at all. That was the theory behind it, that you're responsible. And you would have to answer to God if you did not fulfill your religious responsibility to provide for the spiritual well-being of your subjects. political, theological, political, religious, one and the same. And that was seen from both sides. I have up here competing hierarchies. And that is the whole issue. The ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. And laity simply means not ordained. Being ordained meant that you were different. It wasn't defined until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the seven sacraments, but ordination was always seen as a sacrament because what happened in the ritual of ordination, becoming a priest, your soul was changed. You were different from the laity. That's why in all this conflict between who's in control and who has power in the later Middle Ages, there developed this debate between who is more powerful, the emperor or a simple parish priest. Now, one way, the emperor certainly is. And yet the argument went, but you know what? The emperor himself could go into church and stand behind the altar and say Mass in Latin perfectly. And no transubstantiation would take place. We'll get to more about transubstantiation and other things later, but it's that point in the Mass of elevation of the elements when the elements of bread and wine become actually physically the body and blood of Christ. Again, we'll be talking about that a lot more. That too is only defined in 1215, but that's a long story. We'll get there. But that is what was going on. The emperor could not do that, but the simple parish priest could, because the sacrament of ordination changed his soul to enable it metaphysically to perform the sacraments, which is not a priest's work. It is to allow God to work through the priest to do so. Now, that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But we still have these competing hierarchies. Here I have the papacy and the empire. And on the next slide, I have ecclesiastical and lay hierarchies. Here we can see both sides said that God is in control. Both sides said that. On the ecclesiastical side, we have, God, and then we have the Pope. The College of Cardinals is a long story. We'll hear more about that shortly. Like an advisory group, analogous somewhat to a state legislature, whether it is the Reichstag in the Empire, or the Estates General in France, or the Parliament in England. It's a parliamentary body to help advise the Pope. And then we have archbishops who are underneath the Pope, bishops who are underneath archbishops, priests, and then the people. A bishop is in charge of a diocese. And a bishop is the primary office within Christendom, even though the Pope is above, because the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome, but the Pope is above it. But a bishop was referred to as a perfected priest, because there are things that a bishop can do that an ordinary parish priest cannot. Namely, ordain people. The parish priest cannot ordain other priests. Only the bishop can. A parish priest cannot consecrate a new church. Only the bishop can. So all of these things. The bishop has a lot of power. Also legal power. Going back to the time of the early church already, a bishop, which is a pre-Christian term, just means overseer, was also a judge. Because we have this tension too between ecclesiastical law and judgment and civil law and judgment, which will be more and more problematic as we go along. But those are the issues. And then we see the lay hierarchy on the other side. God, and the emperor, which is related to the Pope. And we have kings. And we have dukes, counts, and margraves. And we have knights. And we have people. There's a parallel of hierarchies. And the question is, who ruled? Who ruled? Which had priority? Which hierarchy? That was the conflict between clerical power and lay power. Not between church and state, because if you're the emperor, the church is my church. The clergy works for me. From the Pope, I'm head of Christendom. Well, God is, but then I'm God's vicar here. And the emperor is supposed to work with me. That's the conflict, not church and state. They both, they can say, okay, well, wait a minute. For the emperor, the model was a state church. For the Pope, it was a church state. And there's definitely validity in that distinction between a church state representing the ecclesiastical view and a state church representing the imperial view or the political side of things. And that was the conflict. But both viewed themselves, the church and the state, as being one and the same. We can't distinguish that. And that's going to be foundational for the rest of this course. Now, after the sacramental system, heresy, and then the church. I've already mentioned the sacraments as the means of salvation. Visible sign of invisible grace is the technical definition. And there were debates over the number of sacraments and what they all meant. There's a distinction between the sacraments and the sacramentals. Sacramentals are things like holy water that you use to cross yourself and other things, but the sacraments are different. Baptism, the Eucharist, those are essential and required for salvation, because that's what it was all about. Salvation at stake. If people didn't believe all of that, it didn't really matter. At this time, everybody believed it. Everybody except for the Jews, and then also the Muslims on the external side of things. Always being a threat, and we'll hear more about that when we get along in things. The threat that Islam always posed to Christendom. Those are the two big tensions there. You believed it. If you believed it, just think about that for a minute. If you believed that in order to be saved, as Jesus basically says, if your right hand causes you to sin, chop it off. It's better to go through life only with one hand than it is to enter hell than it is to life with one hand than it is to enter hell with both. I'm not commenting on the correct interpretation of that passage, but if you believed that, would you do it? It would be stupid if you didn't, because yes, eternity in hell is a lot worse than chopping off your hand for, and living for another 50 years. If you believe that doing X is necessary to your salvation or your damnation, you believe that, you do it. What would you do to get into heaven if you believed that that was the case? Would you be willing to give your life up, sacrifice your life, fighting for something? Probably. Would you be willing to kill for it? What are you willing to kill for? That's a big question. That's what gets us to heresy. Heresy was always a crime against the state. It was not a theological or religious crime. It was a crime against the state to be a heretic. Because heresy was like cancer. It could, but it's like cancer, a virus cancer, viral cancer. It could spread. It was like rot. You may have heard the old saying that one rotten apple can spoil the whole basket. That's heresy. The killing of heretics really didn't start until the 14th century. And then not until the really 16th century did people start killing witches. Well, we'll get there when we get there. So for most of the Middle Ages, heresy was more of an academic proclamation than it was a legal responsibility, but it became that in the later Middle Ages. Beginning, I think the first burning of a heretic was in 1310. Absolutely necessary. Because if you allow a heretic to survive, that heretic can infect other people, sending them to hell. one of the major differences between understanding medieval Christendom and to understand the Reformation, what was going on, because this principle is the same for there. Religion and theology is not an individual choice. For us today, that's what it is. It's individual choice. Okay, I mean, I disagree with you, but I'm not going to kill you because you don't believe what I do. It's not a choice. And it was not a choice with the Reformation. That's one of the things I'll be arguing too. This issue of toleration and tolerance, that is absolutely faulty. That was, an introduction of the Reformation brought about more toleration. Absolutely not. Quite the opposite. But we'll get there when we get there with that. Because reformers too viewed the necessity of killing heretics. John Calvin in Geneva advocated for the execution of the heretic Michael Servetus, who was proclaimed a heretic. Calvin thought they should be executed by beheading, and the city council of Geneva said, no, we're going to burn them like we always have. And they burned Michael Servetus in 1553. I'll come back to that. But my point here is it's a necessary task to burn a heretic to save your society. The church never burned a single heretic. It was always the state that did so. The state was responsible for the executions. That's an issue to understand as we go into the developments that we'll be getting to. And so if you have questions about that, just let me know, because it's very, very, very important. And then the final thing is the church. Final thing on this slide. Because the church, the question is, what is it? How is it defined? And funnily enough, both sides defined it on the fundamental level the same way. It's the communion of the faithful, the communio fidelium, the community of believers. On the papal side, or the ecclesiastical side, they agreed with that. They said, though logical structure of pars pro toto, apart for the whole, we could also refer to the church as the ordained, the clergy. It's this in conflict again over not only the definition of the church, what is a church, even though there's a fundamental agreement, but the implications thereof and how that is worked out in society becomes problematic. This is all part of the developments from, let's say, 476, just for lack of a better term, to when we get there, 1517, which is not when the Reformation began, but that's another issue. We'll talk about that when we get there too. So that being said, there's one final thing, or institution of development I want to say a few things about before then talking about your foundational terms exam, and that is monasticism. Now here too, I'm not going to go into the entire history of monasticism. I would love to, but don't want to take too much of your time here. Monasticism is a long history. A monachos, a monk, in Latin is monachos, and that just means a single individual. It has issues in early Christianity because the whole point is, what do we do? How do we be a Christian? What does it mean? Can we be a Christian only part-time, or do we have to be full-time? And if we're a Christian full-time, what does that mean? There were early people who thought we have to then imitate Jesus. And what did Jesus do before he started his preaching campaign? He went into the desert to face temptation. That's step one. That's what we need to do. We need to go alone into the desert to face temptation, and only then can we then minister to the people. Those became the anchorites, the hermits. But then there came to be the thought, you know what, that's really difficult and it's kind of dangerous. And I relate this to, if any of you have ever vowed to yourself, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm not going to eat X, Y, and Z. And on top of that, I'm also going to go to the gym and work out. And if you make that to yourself as a private vow, it's like, okay, I'm doing great the first 2 or 3 days. And then you say, maybe it won't hurt to have a little bit. Or, I've been really good going to the gym every day for the last 2 or 3 days. I'm really tired, don't feel like it today. Maybe I'll just take today off, right? As an individual, you do that and we rationalize. That's one of the great abilities of human beings that allow us to survive is our ability to rationalize. So we rationalize it. And then say, okay, well, I missed one, I can miss another. And pretty soon it all falls by the wayside. But if you arrange with a friend to do it, that's going to be different. Because then you're responsible to that friend, and that friend is responsible to you to actually go through with what you both agreed to. That is the basis then for what was called Cenobitic monasticism, or Cenobites, who would live in a community. Now, the whole point of this, theoretically, was it was the idea of this is for beginners. Before we can go out and preach, because that's also what Jesus said, go preach the gospel to every nation. Before we can do that, we have to prepare for ourselves for it, just like Jesus did. This also then has issues of Greek philosophy. There were segments of Greek philosophy, avenues of Greek philosophy, which is where the term heresy comes from. Heresis is what you chose to follow. They said, if you want to be a philosopher, which is what? A lover of wisdom. You can't be a lover of wisdom unless you go the whole way and dedicate your entire life to finding wisdom. Therefore, we have to discipline our bodies. Because if you're worried about, what am I going to eat, who am I going to sleep with tonight, et cetera, that's not being spiritual. That's not being mental. That's not devoting yourself to wisdom. That's devoting yourself to physical pleasure or physical needs. And yeah, we all have physical needs. We can't deny those, but we can try to discipline our physical needs. Discipline in Latin is disciplina. And it's the Latin translation of the Greek ascesis, which is also then used in our terms as asceticism. To be an ascetic is someone who is going to be a disciplined person, a disciplina. What is to live a Christian life is a disciplined Christian life. Augustine of Hippo wrote a treatise, De Disciplina Christiana, how to live a disciplined Christian life. That's what all of this becomes about. And monasticism was seen as a group, but also as an individual, hermit, as being a means to do that. Now, if you're living as a group, you also have to have rules for living. How do we live as a group? Now, if you live with other people, and let's say you're in a house, you have to have rules. When can we use the kitchen? Who cleans up? Who does this? Who does the chores? You have to have rules. So rules started to be written for how to live a communal monastic life. The Rule of St. Augustine is the earliest Western one. But the one that became most famous was the Rule of St. Benedict. I'm not going to go into all of this, but the idea was for the Benedictines, we're going to withdraw from society, go out into the wilderness. We'll pray for the people, but we're going to be excluded. And once we join, we join. And this form of Benedictine monasticism became very prevalent. All well and good. And that's why I talk about Cluny. Cluny was a reform of Benedictine monasticism because Benedict, the Rule of St. Benedict, every individual monastery was separate, all underneath the bishop. When Cluny came along, they said, not only do we want to be directly under your authority, Pope, we also want to have a different model. If we become too big, we're not going to have another Cluny. We're going to have a daughter house. And so we'll establish a daughter house here, and I'm the abbot of Cluny, and under me will be then a prior of a daughter house who will be under my authority, and my authority will be under your authority, Pope. It's a pyramid. And that took off, and the Pope said, great. And Cluny became very wealthy and very powerful because people started joining it. This is great. It's a reform. It's always, what's latest and newest and best. That was what it was about. That model became the model for developments thereafter. And we find approximately around the year 1000, beginning on into the 12th century, the establishment of new monastic orders, organized on the same basis as Cluny, underneath the Pope, outside of episcopal control, which is a big thing. And there becomes, I'll talk more about this in later lectures, a conflict between the parish clergy and what's called the regular clergy. And this is the problem. The regular clergy were clergy who followed a monastic rule, regula, because rule in Latin is regula. So if I am following a monastic rule, I am a regular or regular. So if I'm a monastic who's following a monastic rule and I'm a priest, I'm a regular priest. And if I am a parish priest, I am a secular priest. The term seculum meant in the world. So we have these two distinctions between two types of priests, two types of clergy, the regular clergy and the secular clergy. Secular clergy doesn't mean they go out, drinking and whoring and everything else. It means that they are not following a monastic rule. Because the whole development in the 11th, 12th century was this feeling that, we need to follow a rule ourselves. And this becomes starting off, first of all, with what's called the canons. Now, if you're a bishop, you're in charge of the diocese, but you're also in charge of your own parish, a parish that is associated with your bishopric, with the territory, because the diocese is division of the bishopric. So you're also the parish priest. Now, every bishop has a cathedral. You cannot have a cathedral without a bishop, and you can't have a bishop without a cathedral. Coming from the chair, cathedra is Latin for the chair. Cathedra is the bishop's chair. So there's a cathedral where the bishop is. And that cathedral is its own parish. Now, if you're a bishop in the Middle Ages, you're probably, a second or third son of a noble. You really don't want to deal with, the daily life of being a priest, parish priest. You're too much interested in the politics and everything else. So what you do, you appoint priests to your parish, to the cathedral, to do the pastoral work that you're supposed to do. Because technically, a priest is in charge of a parish, and a bishop is in charge of a diocese. An archbishop is in charge of an archdiocese. But the bishops started saying, we are going to appoint priests to take care of issues, pastoral issues, to listen to confessions, to celebrate Mass daily, several times a day. Now, those priests that were attached to the parish of the cathedral were called the canons of the cathedral. And they came to the realization that, we too should reform our lives, and we should live according to a monastic rule. We can't follow the rule of St. Benedict because that is a different type, but we will follow the rule of St. Augustine because Augustine himself was a bishop, and his rule was written for his priests. So the rule of St. Augustine became this part of what was called the canonical movement, this attempt to become part of the world, ministering to people, preaching to people, teaching to people, celebrating the sacraments, while still following a monastic rule. It was become a mixed life, and it was kind of difficult to define legally. And then in the 13th century, that model also applied to a new wave of new monastic groups called the Mendicants. Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinian hermits. Mendicant means poor. If I'm mendicant, I don't have anything. And all these orders were based on the idea of poverty. Now, the rule of St. Benedict, the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were always there. But for the Benedictines, the vow of poverty meant I will not own anything myself. My order will own things. So there was no corporate poverty, but there was individual poverty. With the mendicants, is an issue of we are also going to follow a corporate poverty. Franciscans were the first. I can talk a lot about it. St. Francis was one of the most charismatic and well-known figures in the entire Middle Ages. He renounced everything to follow Christ. Naked and poor following the naked and poor Christ. Jesus as Jesus was here during his lifetime on earth, preaching, rebuilding the church. That was Francis's ideal. He went to the Pope to get permission and confirmation of his way of life, and it was based on saying, I will own nothing. Anything that I own or that we own as an order, actually you, Pope, will own. We will just use it. And it gets to be a big issue. Use and ownership. I'm talking more about that later, but it starts really here, this distinction. Now, the Pope at the time was Innocent III. He was also the Pope at the Fourth Lateran Council. He's also been seen as the Pope that kind of established papal monarchy. And he had a problem on his hands because there were heretical groups that had been deemed heretical, that were advocating poverty. Look, the institutional church is becoming wealthy. The biggest landowner in Europe is becoming wealthy. That's not following Christ. Christ was poor. Jesus was poor. Now, these heretical groups based on poverty were implicitly and often explicitly criticizing the institutional church, the institutional hierarchy. That was what Innocent was trying to deal with, and also was like, oh my God, they do have a point after all. So Innocent said with Francis, wonderful. I will accept ownership of all your property. You can use it. I will own it. Now, we have the same distinction here. It's called usufructus, as it was back in the day, or usufruct. For example, in my office at the university, I have a microfilm reader. I've had it ever since I got here. They ordered it for me. They bought it for me. I can use it. No one else can. But it's not mine. I can use it. It's a property of the university. The computer at my office is the property of the university. But I can use it. That's the distinction. And universities use that basis to get fundraising. If you're wealthy and have an estate, and let's say you don't have any kids or spouses or family, what do I do with it all? The university might knock at your door and say, yeah, you know what? You can give it to us. You can retain the use of it, but we will own it. Until you die, of course. Then we don't have to worry about it. It's a wonderful scheme, but that was what the Franciscans and Pope came up with, this idea. Pope, you own all of our property. We will just use it. The Dominicans come up also wanting to fight against heresy, and the Pope has seen how great they are, and so in 1256, another Pope, Alexander IV, establishes another one, the Augustinian Hermits, the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine. They're called hermits because they were trying to combine both the anchoritic life and the cenobitic life together, following Augustine's rule. And there's all these dispersed little groups, and Alexander IV brings them all together. It's called the Great Union, and forms the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine as a mendicant order. The whole point was to preach and teach to the people. This would cause a lot of conflict with the parish clergy, with the secular clergy, as we'll see later. But that is what's going on. And with that, I think I've covered some of the basics. And again, do the reading. because especially if this long lecture is not all that clear, and of course you can stop it and start it again and listen to it different times. You don't have to sit down and listen to it all at once. You can listen to it in parts. You can come back to it. You can listen to several parts again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's if you listen to it with the reading or having done the reading, I think it will kind of all work together. And this is part of then the necessary background to understand next week's lectures on the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, crisis of the later Middle Ages, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which provides the requisite basis for understanding what's going to be happening in the 16th century. And that is why, too, you have your foundational terms exam the end of this week, which is, well, it's due on Monday, July 13th by 11:59 p.m. Because there are these basic terms and definitions that if you don't understand, you're not going to get. For the foundational terms exam, it is essential that you read the guide to writing the foundational terms exam and take it seriously. There are 20 terms. You need to use the rubric. You need to cite where you're getting your information, meaning either the Myth of the West by page number, if not chapter number 2, or this lecture 1, or week 1, lecture 2. And you need to give those references in parentheses. Make sure you follow the directions. That's important. So make sure you understand what you're being told to do in the guide to writing the foundational exam. If you get these down, this is great. I mean, it's not hard. It shouldn't be hard at all to actually do. These are vocabulary words. If any of you have had a world language that's not your own, you have to study vocabulary. And this is, in some ways, history course is simply that, learning a new vocabulary. Because it's not only the definition, it's also then how to use those words. And that is what the exams will get at. The midterms 1 and 2 is how you use the terms. Now, for midterm 1 and midterm 2 and the final, there are lists of terms to know. There's no list of exam on the list of terms to know. But this is to help you prepare for doing those midterms, which are geared to help prepare you to doing the final, which is the whole point of the whole thing. And also that means citing where you're getting your sources from. One of the things, too, that can be difficult about this course is some of the terms I'm sure you know already. Church, Christianity, maybe even Martin Luther, maybe even, John Calvin, maybe even, the Middle Ages or whatever. But your understanding, I'm sure, is going to be different than the understanding that's being used here. You can't just assume that what you know is the definition of these terms is the definition used for these terms in this course. And that's what the exam is getting at. Do you understand the definition and the use of these terms in this course? Because that is what your grade is based on. The course material, which are the lectures and the textbooks. In this case, the Myth of the West, chapters 4 through 10, and the document, the essay on history, myth, religion, where sometimes it starts out, here are the basic definitions. So on that, you just say, SAC, history, myth, and whatever, page, whatever. That's important because that will help you understand the rest of the course. Now, I think I said somewhat before in the last lecture, I'm not trying to undermine or change your beliefs. I'm trying to help you understand your beliefs. And if you feel that your beliefs are being challenged, all the better. Why did I say all the better? Because if we don't challenge our beliefs, we're just putting blinders on. I'm not telling you what the theological truths are, but I can tell you what the historical truths are. And as I said last lecture, historical truth is not the same as theological truth. It's what can be determined based on the extant evidence. Now, theologically, I would argue that theological truth has to be based on historical truth. That is a discussion that we could have privately. If you're interested, let me know. But here, the issue is learning the definitions of these terms based on the course material, meaning this lecture and the assigned readings, so that you can note in your answer where you've gotten your information for that answer, which you'll need to do on the midterms and on the final. If you have any questions about that, just please feel free to ask me or ask Lucy, but do read the guide to writing the foundational terms exam. And I'll be grading it as soon as I can be, because we have midterm 1 already due a week later. This is fast and furious, and indeed it is. So good luck with it all. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you again next week, so to speak, at least with the week 2 lectures, lecture 1 and lecture 2 for next week, whether you do it all in the same week or whatever, after your foundational terms exam. Okay. Thank you very much. Good luck, and again, email me if you need to. Thank you much, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.